this time of year, farmers have made a lot of their fertility choices for next year, put out some fall phosphorus, potassium, maybe even some nitrogen. But the question is, what about in the spring? Do I need a little bit more right at planting time? Do I need a starter fertilizer?
Okay, so when we talk about starter fertilizer, I think we need to make one clarification here. There's pop-up fertilizer, which would be in furrow, and then there's starter fertilizer, which would be not in furrow. So I don't consider starter what I put in the furrow. I call that pop-up.
So when we're talking in furrow pop-up, not in furrow, like a 2x2 placement, or maybe we go directly below the seed, but we go a few inches down.
So a lot of people will just group them together and call it all starter fertilizer. So I mean, it just depends on what you're talking about here. I will say this, you've got to have plant food out there if you want to raise a good crop. And if you think that you're going to go out there with a couple gallons of 1034 or 5 gallons of 1034 and that's all the fertility I need for my crop, well, good luck with that. You're probably not going to raise great yield over a long period of time, unless your soil was unbelievably built up in the past. So anyway, my point is you can't get all your fertility needs with just a couple gallons of something. Now, there are some products that are highly concentrated and very available to crops, and we wanted to talk about those today. But we also want to talk about the negative side if you use high salt fertilizers and what can potentially happen to your crop if you put them in furrow.
Well, here's really the key. When you're talking about high salt load fertilizers, you just can't put them in close contact with seed. Salt can harm your germination, it can harm your seedling growth, and you can end up with a lot of different issues in your field, and none of them are good.
Okay, let's talk about what's basically an acceptable rate. What we've kind of always said is if you have 30-inch rows, if you put 3 gallons of 1034 out there on a per acre basis, you're going to roughly have 5 pounds of salt. And 5 pounds of salt per acre in 30-inch rows, and that's really about the limit. Now, if you have wetter conditions, you can probably get by with a little more. If you have drier conditions, you should probably use less. So the less moisture you have, the more sensitive your crop is going to be. You've got to be really careful with this, because the last thing you want to have happen is you just went and spent $10, $20 worth of fertilizer and it hurt your yield by 5 bushels. That doesn't make any sense.
Moisture is one thing, but so is organic matter. And I did some trials on my blank slate field. It's a new piece of ground that I bought that has very low organic matter. And when you've got low organic matter, you just can't tolerate much salt. Really, that organic matter is kind of your fudge factor out in your field.
Your buffer.
Yeah, you've got a buffer for the crop. That's a good way to put it. And when you look at a low organic matter soil, you can use less fertilizer close to the seed than you can if you had a high organic matter soil.
Going back to when my dad first started farming, he ran trials years and years ago, and he ended up with a lot of similar results to what we've had today, where as long as you've got a really good overall fertility program, do you need starter? Well, you don't need it, but or I should say pop-up. You don't need pop-up, but having something in the furrow, you do end up with a little bit drier corn in the fall. A lot of times you'll get 2 points drier corn in the fall. Well, if you raise 200 bushel corn and you figure 6 cents a point for drying, that's 12 cents a bushel or $24 an acre. So theoretically, as long as you're spending less than $24 an acre, you need absolutely zero yield gain. All you need is to gain that 2 points of moisture, and you've way more than paid for your stuff.
Well, you've got yield gain potential, you've got a moisture differential potential, you've also got the speed of that crop getting to tassel, for example. We had a trial just a few years back where we got to tassel several days earlier. Well, you're going to end up with drier corn when you do that. You're going to miss some of the disease issues that you're going to have. You're also going to miss some of that summer heat that a lot of times we end up with in South Dakota, getting some really hot winds right around that tasseling time, and that can hurt us as far as our pollination goes. So there are quite a few things that could work to your advantage by using a little bit of starter. The other thing that I look at is getting a healthier plant earlier in the season.
Wait, now, you said starter, now you mean pop-up. Again, starter, we're talking about 2x2 or something like that. If we're talking pop-up specifically, that's the in-furrow stuff. When it's in furrow, again, you'll end up with a little bit drier corn typically.
Well, this year I decided to try some things a little bit different on this blank slate field that I've been talking about. And I wanted to put a lot of liquid right in the furrow to really try and debunk a lot of the myths that Brian falls prey to. What I did is I found products that are very low salt, and that's really the whole key. For our farm, if we've put fertilizer with a lot of salt in it in the furrow as a pop-up, that can be a tough deal. But Agriculture Liquid has got a couple products, Pro Germinator on the phosphorus side, Sure K on the potassium side, that I wanted to try out as my full program putting liquid right in the furrow. This year I planned for about 150 bushel corn on this new piece of ground that I got. That's what we fertilized for, and that's what we got. We got 151.7. All I did is put liquid out there. I didn't put any dry fertilizer. I put 10 gallons of a combination of the phosphorus and potassium source and some micronutrients right in the furrow. That's all I needed, and it worked really well for me this year.
Okay, and you tried 15 gallon, you tried 20 gallon?
I tried 15 and I tried 20. The 15 was a little better yield. I think the 20, by the time I got there, it looks like we did hurt the roots just a little bit when I got to a really excessive rate.
And again, we're talking almost no organic matter out there and
no fertility.
Yeah,
no
and a little bit lighter soil. So, I mean, 20 gallons all in the furrow, that's really pushing it.
It was. Yep. It was, but that's how we learn. And they just do a strip or two like that and hope that it doesn't hurt you too bad in your yield. And really you hope that, wow, it just really popped and you said, man, I got 250 bushels or something there. Well, it turns out that once I got to 150, fertility was no longer my limiting factor. Now organic matter, my planting, I had a little bit of trouble getting stand establishment in some of that light, low organic matter soil. So there are just other things to talk about there too. But really, there are some products you can use safely as a pop-up and others you can't.
Okay, couple last points. Micronutrients, we think it's a real good idea to use a low rate of pop-up fertilizer and then throw some micronutrients in there. I'd probably use a blended product at a relatively low rate. Again, we don't want to overdo things, but we like it in furrow because then we know the plant's going to get to it. And the other thing, we get a lot of questions on soybeans. Should I use this on soybeans? If you're going to use pop-up fertilizers on soybeans, I'd try to keep it off the seed, but really I'd try to do that with corn too. And you want to use a very low rate. Pop-up fertilizers can hurt soybeans much more than they can hurt corn. We do use pop-up fertilizers on our soybeans every year. We had great soybeans again this year. Just keep that rate low.
There's certainly a lot of moving parts in the starter fertilizer discussion, but when it comes to our weed of the week, there's only one thing you need to remember: get it under control on your farm. We'll show you how coming up later in the show.